I am Lindsay Bennett. I will be presenting on behalf of myself and my colleague, Pious Malliar-Bellian. So I will do my best of presenting the whole topic. His expertise is also spiritual healing, so he has some of the depth to the presentation, but had a travel conflict come up and couldn't be here today. But we are both from the Indiana University School of Social Work. I just finished my PhD like 2 weeks ago. It's very exciting, so I can't put doctor on my slide yet, but I'm taking that greeting in person. And Pius is a PhD candidate and will also be joining a Catholic University in the fall in Washington, D.C. as a full-time faculty member there. So our discussion today is spiritual healing within the helping professions, discussion of the biopsychosocial spiritual model in clinical practice. Oh, good. There we go. Okay. So agenda today, I wanted to open things up with a discussion, so I'll get to that in a moment. And then I'll go through what the literature says about the definition of spiritual healing and how things are discussed currently. And then I'll move into a discussion of the roles practitioners, clinical practitioners can and should play in the role of spiritual healing. And then the concept of the biopsychosocial spiritual assessment, what we mean by that and what is currently used in practice, at least within the American context, and implications for clinical practice from there. Okay, so again, I wanted to begin with a bit of discussion with you all, with a couple of questions. What words come to mind when you think of spiritual healing and how that should be defined? Self-identity. Self-identity. Empowerment.
Making better.
Making better, yes. Healing to make better.
Peace.
Peace. To say no. Is that, yes, I like that too with empowerment, like the ability to be able to say no, empowered to hold that position.
Not to feel better, but get better in feeling.
Sure, yeah. Maybe like kind of being able to be regardless of if you are better or, you know, whatever that means.
Yeah.
Better or not better, just
To be.
exist. Yeah. I love, there's a quote that I love along the lines of peace, because I use that a lot in my own practice and things like that. But the quote is, you keep pairing me with silence, peace said, when the real reality of peace is the mighty clamoring of chains ripping off of the wall. Like a freedom, right? It's not silence or passivity, it's finding power. Feeling empowered. Lori Houston, I'll have to remember the spelling of her name. Husten, I believe. I have a friend in my office.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I guess then moving on to the opposite, what are some things that we think are not conducive for healing? Things that are kind of counterintuitive to a healing process. Aggression. Auto-aggression. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Silence.
Silence, yes.
Shame.
Shame.
Stagnation.
Stagnation, being stuck. Delusion. Delusion. Yeah. Lack of critical thinking. Guilty. Yeah. Yeah. Guilt and shame, I think those two play together. Thank you.
Waiting for a miracle.
Do what?
Waiting for a miracle.
You're waiting for a miracle, yes. Kind of passive, maybe, rather than being active in the process. Anybody else? Thank you. Thank you all for indulging. I think those are all great, and some of those we will discuss further as we look at what the literature says. So first I wanted to start with definition of spiritual healing. There isn't a lot of definitive definitions about spiritual healing. There's kind of a variety of language used, and so sometimes that can be problematic when you're thinking about clinical practice and what the goal should be when it comes to healing, if there isn't kind of clarity around the issue. But Firth and a colleague define spiritual healing as a transformative and holistic process, meaning we're looking at all aspects of the person when we're talking about healing, and transformative being coming from point A to point B and acknowledging the process and the lineage that needs to happen there. And this being a repair of recovery of mind, body, and spirit. Is the language used. I, in my own thinking and practice, like to also acknowledge that spirit has its own meaning depending on the person. So being person-centered and acknowledging what someone might be coming to you in clinical practice with, and as far as their background and how that might shape what they think of as spirit versus self versus, maybe spirit isn't a word that aligns with some people. So I just like to be mindful of language there. And spiritual healing should also acknowledge that there is plenty of room in this world, as we know in this conference, for spiritual and religious trauma or injury. And so being able to acknowledge that as a part of a person's history potentially and move from there in a healing framework. There should be emphasis on the individual and recognition of their progress as a person. And spiritual healing can be performed by one or more people. So in clinical practice, that can be a therapist, kind of in a therapeutic realm, or maybe a group collective healing environment. I suppose I forgot to add that in my introduction. I'm also a therapist in Indiana, so I come from a clinical background as well. So then moving into a discussion of the purpose of spirituality. So spirituality is a framework that allows us to define meaning and purpose in our lives, purposefulness. And so for those who have had spiritual injury or some sort of transformation in spiritual identity, being able to reframe what meaning making and purposefulness looks like from a healing perspective, that should be a part of the healing journey. Being able to reform meaning making. Spirituality at a pure intention should have a positive impact on overall well-being and is sort of like within the dimension of wellness. If we're looking at holistic wellness and whole person health and healing, then spirituality should sort of be a domain or a bubble within holistic health. Or self-awareness and spiritual development. So spirituality sort of can give us a guide to be able to develop our self and identity. In cases of spiritual injury or moral injury, maybe there needs to be re-identification or reforming identity that happens there. And then spiritual development, maybe there needs to be a transformative process there. Well, if there's been moral injury. And spirituality can help us to assess different spiritual perspectives and allow for diversity. And I think that leads us into the next kind of, not yet. Okay, just kidding. Okay, so holistic healing in the spiritual sense. So again, focusing on this one bubble. So in clinical practice, there is a need currently to address spirituality and that part of holistic health. So I'll talk about gaps there. So in the American context, we currently have traditionally like a biopsychosocial assessment where we look at biology, psychological impacts of someone's mental health, and then social or environmental influence. And oftentimes spirituality can kind of be overlooked, despite this being a very big part of some people's lives. So with this gap, there is like this glaring need to be able to honor spirituality as a part of whole person health, and the need for self-actualization to be able to, or for a person to be able to reach their full potential. And if you're working with somebody in a mental health field or healing sphere, then self-actualization helps promote progress and healing. So for clinical practitioners, ultimately we have a responsibility to help our clients navigate through trauma, regardless of what that is. And what Pious and I have discussed frequently and how we kind of came up with this presentation is that we're both social workers as well. Within our field of social work, there's kind of a shying away from spirituality sometimes, like to keep the practice or interventions we use sort of secular and no, I don't want to touch this because I don't want to offend, kind of a thing. And so there's this gap and need to be able to incorporate spirituality to be able to best meet the needs of our clients. So the spiritual lens is needed in the healing process, and there should be a trauma-informed approach. So being able to acknowledge a diverse array of spiritual practices and perspectives, rather than kind of this shyness away from spirituality because you don't want to impose your own beliefs or don't want to show judgment or anything like that, which is true, but that's true in all that we do. So spirituality should be a piece of this as well. So there should be an ongoing assessment, just like there is with anything else, like social influences and environmental influences. Spirituality should be just as important in the conversation of healing and clinical interventions. So this is where we discuss the need for the introduction of biopsychosocial spiritual assessments. So as I said, right now we use biopsychosocial assessments, this being biological influences of a person's mental health, psychological influences, and social or environmental contexts that influence somebody's mental health. Further healing is currently undefined or vague. So like I said in the beginning, and kind of why I wanted to discuss with you all, there are a lot of words that can be used to capture what healing means. I think it can also be deeply personal and subjective. So there's like this need to further the body of research that says what healing can look like and can encompass, and be able to acknowledge that everybody has varying perspectives and life experiences that influence where they are. And often spirituality currently in research and in practice, it's most often discussed at the end of life. So when you are getting to the end of your life, you might have a clinician try and talk about spirituality with you to make peace with the fact that you are dying. But what about the rest of your life when you were living in the world, and had all of this this time for spirituality to be such a huge part of your life? So then insert the need for the biopsychosocial spiritual assessment and what this would mean. So if we had something like this, and some people, on an individual basis or like a private practice setting might already have this incorporated. So what Pious and I were really thinking about and conceptualizing was being able to make this the standard, like that this should be the standard in mental health care and in mental health care practice. So with this intervention, it would allow a practitioner to meet the client where they are at. So when you are doing an intake assessment, the goal is to be able to gather all information about a client and as much as you possibly can. And so adding this spiritual component allows you to get all of the background information needed to understand, someone's spiritual journey throughout their life course and where they are at, and being able to honor whatever that means for your client. And so then this also provides a foundation for learning of your client's spiritual health. So being able to assess for things like spiritual trauma and moral injury, I think is very important. There's a sort of a theme in my clinical practice right now, and I think I kind of cycle through various themes throughout my years. But right now, without this assessment, and even being someone who thinks of this as very important, there have been several clients that I've worked with for months, and then I find out that there's some sort of spiritual injury or harm, and that's what needs really to be the focus of our therapeutic intervention. So it's like we've spent all of this time working together and maybe still doing important work when it comes to healing, but I did not have that piece of information and didn't have that lens. So a gap even in my own practice with clients. And then, so with this, you are able to then find the natural allies using a patient-centered approach. So finding what the support systems are, looking through, various systems, but then also beyond to be able to acknowledge where a person's supports may lie, both within spiritual communities and outside of spiritual communities. And then looking again at the holistic piece of healing, if you're incorporating spirituality in a more intentional way, then you are able to kind of have the whole person in knowledge. You have knowledge of the whole person, and so that you can address the person appropriately. And so then you have the integration of body, mind, and spirit. Language needs to be dependent upon your client as well, meeting them where they are. And allowing your patient to seek help from the practitioner. In the spirit of discussion, I'm just curious, since we have so many perspectives, is anybody a mental health practitioner who does kind of already incorporate spiritual assessment? So considerations of practitioners or implications for practice. I'm going very fast again because it's just me, so I apologize. This might be a shorter session than was intended originally, but so we sort of posit that helping professionals should have increased awareness of how spiritual injury from life experiences impact survivors. I think beyond that, just the role of spirituality and meaning making in general should be acknowledged. That's okay, as I've said along the way. And again, we're looking at social work specifically, so I certainly can't speak for all practitioners or even all fields within mental health, but there is definitely a culture where we are positioned of, let's not talk about this. Let's kind of shy away from this. That's personal information. We're here to talk about your feelings and how we process through hard things. But if you don't have those foundational pieces, it can be really difficult to do that. So that being kind of step one, just needing to increase the awareness of practitioners. And then the establishment of body safety being very important for determining resources and interventions. This being critical for the healing process and keeping clinical interventions trauma informed. That's more my area of research, is the trauma piece and complex trauma specifically, and the impact that has on people when it comes to building relationships. So in being able to look at spiritual healing and moving through this transformative process, just like with any other healing, you need to have the relationship piece first. So spending adequate time as a clinician to build trust and sort of ask the right questions to be able to get to know your client and create that safe and comfortable space. That could be said in just about any mental health presentation, not necessarily just one focused on spirituality. And then there needs to be a consideration of and attention to diverse viewpoints and spiritual experiences and healing among helping professionals. I think this might be one of the, again, speaking from my position in the world, but one of the reasons that shies some practitioners away is there's such an overwhelming majority. Again, especially where I am, I live in a deep red Midwestern Indiana state. So there's almost like when it comes to cultural humility and cultural sensitivity, I think spirituality is a place where there might be some lacking in terms of how much practitioners know about varying spiritual practices and viewpoints. So I think there also needs to be a willingness to learn and do deep dives when needed if you have a client that has very different experiences than you or things that you aren't familiar with. Okay. Just a couple of more things there for implications. So the needs or the implication for practitioners, if you are implementing the biopsychosocial spiritual assessment, would be to evaluate experiences subjectively. So that just meaning honoring the perspectives of your clients and their life stories and all of that, which is also standard in practice. The application of this model should be used like across settings, which is our position here. And there is a need to continue to elevate like the scientific nature and like some of the rigor and the body of research around spiritual healing. I think particularly within the mental health field to sort of bring the like the power behind the topic. I think sometimes that's another reason things get shooed away, is if there isn't enough research to support that this is something that's very important for people and very prevalent in lived experiences. And there's all of this research to back up these positions, then things can get discredited. So that being more Pious's area of research, discussion of spiritual healing and what moral injury looks like for survivors to try and advance the literature and need for healing interventions there. I'm sorry you're missing his half. So I have another couple of discussion questions here, but I asked a bit about your experiences with spiritual healing, but I also would like to get perspectives on audience members, how you feel about like the integration of spirituality into mental health and maybe what that looks like amongst your different practice settings, how you feel like we're doing. I will share, I think Pious's contact information is in the website agenda as well. So if anybody has any further questions or wants to connect further, we're both very open to that. And I thank you all for coming.